When I was a kid, we would visit my grandparents a lot. One pair of them lived around an hour and a half to 2 hours away, and we'd visit sometimes as often as once a month. That meant between 3 and 4 hours of riding in the car for each visit, which might as well have been an eternity to a kid. The other pair of grandparents lived in an entirely different state, 12 hours of driving away. We'd visit them once or twice a year, meaning every 365 days, 1 or 2 of those days would consist purely of sitting in the back of a Jalopy, sucking up batteries with my Game Boy to play Pokemon Red or Gold. You could shave some time off the trip if you took a very specific, very dangerous mountain road. I only remember taking it once because it scared the living heck out of me both times. You have to understand, my parents didn't have a lot of money at the time and were really into muscle cars, so their daily drivers were a 1967 Pontiac Tempest and a 1970 Pontiac Le Mans. Well, they also had a 1970 GTO, which means all 3 cars we owned were different trim packages on the same fundamental model. That was the higher-end car we had, and was therefore dedicated to the drag strip and car shows. You didn't drive the GTO hundreds and hundreds of miles. You used the often barely running Tempest for that. In said trip through that mountain pass, the Tempest almost slid off an icy cliff edge multiple times due to the dark, the snow obscuring where the road ended, and the old, dim headlights. We almost hit a boulder the size of a car that had fallen from above and settled in the middle of the road. And they were just opening up the road after an avalanche. My uncle nearly fell off the cliffside while going to the restroom because he wasn't aware that he'd walked off solid ground and made his way onto a thick sheet of snow jetting off of the cliff. We had to stop every 15 minutes to put snow on the fuel pump to cool it down. You see, the only fuel pump we had was for a much smaller 4-cylinder engine, but this was a whopping 4.7-liter 8-cylinder, meaning the fuel pump would overheat almost immediately, thanks to the steeply inclined switchback roads. All of this in a car from the mid-60s that had no ABS, finicky power steering, drum brakes on the rear, and parts that had been cobbled together with whatever money they could spare. In our house at the time, the motto was effectively, drive Pontiac or die cold, hungry, and depressed. I mention all of that because Jalopy is a game that aims to channel that. In terms of story, Jalopy is about the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War. Your character and their uncle Lufti were isolated from the rest of the family in Turkey when the Berlin Wall was originally erected. Now that it has fallen, they can finally make their way back to Istanbul, using their ratty communist people's car, the Leica 601. If you're not well versed in the history of cars created by communist governments over the decades, traditionally most of them were extremely simple, but built like bricks. Cheap construction, Bodhi suspensions, very little power, poor safety, and efficient with lacking features. The Leica 601 is actually based on a real-life East German car of this type, known as the Trabant 601. Though I suspect its name actually comes from the first dog to be sent into space, the Soviet dog Laika, who unfortunately died from overheating well before their test was complete. Surprisingly, the Trabant 601 was relatively modern for the time, unlike many of its peers, particularly across the Soviet Union. Still, it was designed to be the absolute bare minimum in a lot of ways, so luxury was at a major deficit. In particular, it relied on a 2-stroke engine. While greatly simplified compared to the 4-stroke engines most non-electric cars have used for over half a century at this point, it output a horrible blue smoke thanks to the fact that you had to add oil straight to the fuel mixture. While the 2-stroke has evolved a lot since then, there's a reason it's generally limited to things like mopeds, snowmobiles, or some motorcycles today. And this is what Jalopy is really about mechanically. The car, the terrain, and attempting to reconcile the two long enough to reach your next destination. Jalopy expects you to perform regular maintenance on your vehicle, because parts don't last long in your people's car. You'll regularly need to repair your carburetor, engine, and if you're lucky enough to have one, your air filter. But problems can also crop up with your fuel tank, ignition coil, wheels, and even the water dispenser for your barely functioning windshield wipers. If you're lucky, you'll find replacement parts that are an improvement on abandoned Leicas in the wild or at scrapyards. Otherwise, you're gonna have to invest a lot of money you probably don't have in parts at the plentiful Leica-centric part shops, or pray the local market in each town has the necessary repair kits. When you start out, your Leica is incredibly slow. 0 to 60 kilometers an hour, or a little over 37 miles an hour, takes a whopping 21 seconds if you're on flat ground. If you're going even slightly uphill, you can forget it. Despite this, the front-wheel drive car can barely manage to maintain grip when it's raining, or if you run through the various road hazards you can find, from unpaved surfaces and potholes to oil slicks and puddles. It can genuinely be incredibly slow going, and if your tires are already in poor shape, hitting a pothole at speed will all but guarantee you a flat. So you'll likely want to carry a tire repair kit with you as well. Though swapping better tires in the front can improve traction, as can strategically adding weight through the trunk or the roof rack if you're lucky enough to be able to afford one. You also want to be careful of your own choices along the way. Leave your lights, wipers, or radio on while the car itself is off. You might find the next morning that your battery is drained. Ignition coil in poor condition, your poor Leica will struggle to start. Don't get the right mixture of oil in your fuel? Too lean and your engine will wear extra swiftly. Too rich and the car will be even slower, putting you at excess risk of running into trouble with one of your other parts due to the extra time spent on the road. Now, thankfully, you're not left completely high and dry along the way. Your main source of income in Jalopy is the sales of items you find abandoned along the journey. Whether it's excess car parts you come across, old car parts you have no use for any longer, or commodities like meat, wine, textiles, smokes, or even empty oil bottles, being resourceful is important. Each rest stop will have different items in their inventory. Take different items, and the economy for an area will dictate what price they'll offer for things you have for sale, though they also have a limited amount of money to buy your products with as well. On top of this, you might have to contend with the dying fascism and iron grip on trade throughout each region. Every new destination will have a border crossing, where you are required to present your passports, and your vehicle may be inspected for contraband. You never know what commodity might be illegal in the next area until you reach the border crossing, or read about it in the newspaper. So if you come to a border crossing with items that aren't allowed for import, you have a choice. Do you go back and sell it for whatever pittance you could get where you just came from? Do you drop it all and move on hoping you have enough money at the next town? Or is it worth risking the hefty fines you'll incur if they decide to search your vehicle and find the items? That choice only gets harder once you realize that illegal imports are always worth an enormous sum of money in that region. But if you're caught, they're confiscated, leaving you with a hole in your wallet and nothing to sell. The thing that, for me, makes Jalopy so special is how well it uses these mechanics to translate the unsettling, tense feeling of a long road trip when you're in a beater that may or may not make it another mile. But at the same time, the incredibly simple but surprisingly varied visuals, the pleasant music, the tactile feel of physically managing your car and your supplies, the search for secret goodies you might find along the way, as well as the presence of Uncle Lufty and his stories bring out the positive of such trips. I always loved when we would stop at truck stops to eat a trucker's breakfast, or use one of those stupid claw machines that all but guaranteed you lose. And while looking out of the front windshield into the black expanse of an empty night road always conjured images of a giant skeleton appearing out of nowhere, grabbing our car and eating it for some reason, there was something serene about watching countless miles of nature and humanity roll by. Jalopy leverages this idea well by making each leg of the journey randomized, like a roguelike. When you set off from the motel each morning, you can choose from one of 3 routes, which will tell you the length of the stint, the weather, the quality of the road surface, and or if any stops like rest areas will appear along the way. Do you have enough fuel to climb steep mountain switchbacks on a dirt road for 450 kilometers? What happens if there's a shortcut that's flooded due to rain? Is an extra rest stop to restock worth that extra 120 kilometers? I've seen a lot of people heavily criticize Jalopy for this design. They'll say it's boring or tedious, or that it lacks variety in the gameplay. And the game, in my experience, does have many technical issues. With a 7th gen i5 and a GTX 1050, I could only barely lock to 60 FPS when I turned screen space ambient occlusion off, turned off the mirrors, set the AI car density to medium or below, and ran the game at 1080p. But even then, rain still caused dips fairly regularly. It's baffling for a game that looks this visually simple, and with this short of a draw distance. I also had a hell of a time getting it to work right with my PS4 controller. Initially, I plugged the controller in through USB, but that made the game map left stick movement in a digital form instead of analog, meaning every slight tap of the left stick was a giant step that made precision impossible. It also had an extremely strange controller map, but when I tried to remap the inputs, it didn't replace the original inputs, meaning putting gas on R2 meant that R2 would simultaneously press the gas pedal and engage or disengage the parking brake. This was a problem whether or not I used a DS for Windows to make the controller emulate a 360 pad. Only once I connected the controller through Bluetooth did Jalopy see it correctly, fixing the issue. I also did run across a couple of the more common complaints people have in terms of polish. At one point I fueled my car up at the pump, put in the correct oil mixture, and then took some items in the store to sell. I then changed my mind about one of the items I wanted to sell and canceled the transaction. This took the fuel away and gave me my items back, except for the oil I'd used, since it technically wasn't part of the transaction itself. Another time, I sold a lot of stuff at once and tried to buy several tires. When I did though, one of the tires disappeared behind the counter or something after the transaction went through, meaning I'd wasted a rather large chunk of change. By and large though, the technical experience with the game was much more solid than first impressions suggested. As for the other complaints, I get it. Jalopy isn't for everyone. It is pretty safe to argue the game is boring or tedious. But this is yet another case where I don't really think that's a bad thing. For me, that was an absolutely necessary part of the experience. It made it rewarding to stumble across an engine part that was a huge upgrade over my current setup. Doubly so when I didn't have the necessary repair kit on hand to repair it for immediate use, meaning I'd have to decide what other supplies to throw out to make space for it until I could get to the next rest stop. And what about the extreme weight penalty that puts on the tires, which might already be moments from popping? Before I'd stopped recording, I'd done 3 playthroughs of Jalopy, taking around 13 hours total, 2 journeys to Turkey from Berlin, and then 1 journey back. Despite my optimistic view of the game once I'd gotten the technical hangups out of the way, I didn't expect I'd put half that time in. And what's more interesting is that I still want to keep playing. Something about this game's design really hits the nail on the head for me, and it's a game I think would be incredibly fun to play with a group of people who won't make snoring noises and pretend to fall asleep 10 minutes in. People who can appreciate its attempts at translating the raw road trip vibe. I genuinely hope one day we can see Jalopy 2 on the horizon. I can imagine the cool expanded mechanics right now. The suspension and drivetrain could be part of the formula. Maybe you could pick from several different Jalopys, many of which you can either purchase secondhand from people you meet along the way, or even just find abandoned in a ditch. These cars could offer different drivetrain configurations or engine types with benefits and detriments, make it more of an impromptu exploratory road trip that you can plot out between like 20 or 30 different countries. You can pick your ultimate destination location and the places you visit along the way, complete with a landmark to stop by in each country. Maybe allow the player to bring NPC friends that will provide their own stories and ruminations, as well as tactical benefits. One might be good at haggling, or another might be able to spot more stuff on the side of the road, raising the rate at which goodies spawn. But their extra weight and gear might put a bit more wear on the car and require more spaces taken up to house their stuff. Though, if you don't take enough people to fill the back seat, it could be used as extra storage. These NPCs could also optionally offer deviations from your planned route that might be extra difficult, but will afford players a story moment unique to that NPC, or the chance to find a nice secret. Maybe have an occasional penalty for, say, leaving the window of the car down when you stay the night at a motel, causing one or two things to be stolen in the dead of night. Or allow stuff to slowly fall out of the trunk if you forget to close it and drive off. The point is, I really enjoyed Jalopy a lot, and am excited to make the trip again every once in a while. It's a truly unique experience that can't be provided by any other entertainment mediums, short of just taking a road trip in a crappy car. Jalopy had to be a game. And while it's not for everyone, if it sounds interesting at all to you, I'd definitely recommend giving it a shot. But what do you guys think? Have any of you played Jalopy? Did you enjoy it? What's another game you feel uniquely and unconventionally channels a certain experience within the medium? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.